Welcome to the SIDA podcast. I'm the host, Dr. Stolla Wodke, and today's guest is Andrew Kay. With Andrew, I will explore different forms of music and how music is different from sound healing. Welcome, Andrew. It's wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Stella. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. Andrew Kay is an acclaimed musician, educator, and sound healer from Toronto, Canada. His work bridges the world of performance, education, and holistic healing. His musical journey spans Indo-Jazz, world music, Indian Classical Raga, contemporary jazz, and improvised music. Beyond his achievement as a performer, Andrew is deeply committed to exploring the transformative power of sound and vibration. As a sound healer, practitioner, and educator, he uses music and vibration as a powerful modality for healing, transformation, and wellness. Andrew, you are kind enough to give us a little bit of and feel of your music, and you would like to, yeah, give us a little bit of try and taste of
Yeah,
your
sure.
music.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'll just play a little bit, maybe just to give a sense. So I'm gonna play an improvisation that I'll just come to in this moment. That's inspired by a rag or a raga that I learned while living in India, and this is rag Charukeshi, and so it kind of speaks to the essence of the moon. I'll tell a little bit more about the raga maybe after, but just you can already take that into mind as you're listening, and really just a sense of like where do these melodies take you. So if you want to close your eyes, if you want to imagine or go on a little journey internally, you can do that with the music as I'm playing, and I'll just play for a few minutes and kind of create that feeling for everyone. Okay.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. And now I have to come back to the here and now so I remember my questions. um, Andrew, you I think you like challenges because you have told me before that, you chose the saxophone to, play classical music, but then also Indian Raga music. So, first of all, you're really at home in different forms of music and have mastered them for you with the saxophone. But you also have lived in different parts of the world. So, would you like to just share a little bit of your story and how you ended up doing what you're doing today?
Sure, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a fairly musical family. My older brother is also a saxophone player and a musician, and so at a certain point in my childhood, I think I kind of chose to get closer to him and choose the same instrument, and I really fell in love with the saxophone when I was about 12, 12 years old, and I picked it up pretty quickly, and I think that was kind of the beginning of my inward journey of like kind of what is it to work with material, and with learning an instrument, it's a lot about technique and learning songs and inspiration from what you're listening to. And so I was lucky to have great suggestions and great offerings from like my brother and my uncle, who's also a professional musician, to like some of the great traditional music in the world of jazz specifically. And so I kind of through my teenage years I was really deeply going into the jazz tradition and learning and listening, playing. I was playing a lot in school. I went to an arts high school, and I wanted more challenging situations, so I went to another program called the Humber Community Music School, where I was able to study with some of Canada's top jazz musicians, and so I was really lucky to have that exposure to that kind of quality, but that music at that time. And I didn't know it, I don't think, as I was going through it. It was just something I was passionate about, and I loved, just being in the music and practicing and playing. But it really kind of led me to question more meaning in my life, like, searching for meaning. And I know that in my last year of high school, I had to do a project both for my music class, but also for my English class. And I read a book, and I wasn't always a fan of English class so much. I didn't like having to do the readings and things. I was more into science, math, and music and sports. But in this last year, I had a wonderful teacher that really encouraged me, and I found this book called American Gods by Neil Gaiman. And there
Mhm.
was something about that world of worlds and the meeting of all these different spirits and gods and the battle they go through that opened me up to something. I think that in that moment, I was listening to a lot of John Coltrane and Wayne Shorter, and really trying to understand, okay, what am I looking for in this exploration of music? And so that kind of led me to search lots of different styles of music. I was looking for influences from all around the world. I was listening to music from South America or Africa or from the East, just as a way to kind of, in jazz music, you listen to the great masters of the past and the great records. It was still, I grew up at a time where I still have to go and buy the CDs and listen to them. Everything wasn't online yet. So there was something about that ritual of getting a new CD and listening to it over and over. I had my Walkman, my CD player, and listening nonstop to records. So, in my search for influence, I was looking at lots of different musics and cultures around the world. And at a certain point in my university years, I discovered an album called Call of the Valley, which is an incredible album featuring some of India's top, maestros. Hari Prasad Chaurasia, who's a bansuri player, Zakir Hussain, an incredible tabla player. And so this album like kind of just perked my ears up and said, well, what is this music and where does it come from? And I was fortunate enough to live in a really wonderful household with my brother and a really good friend of mine, Justin. And the three of us, we said, you know what, we got to learn more about this music, this Indian classical music. And so we were really lucky to create an ensemble at school to explore not traditional Indian classical music, but more crossover music or Indo-Jazz, let's say.
Hmm.
And a great tabla player here in Toronto, like a mentor at that time, Ravi Nempali, he was our director of that. And every week he would come in with CDs of all the most incredible recordings of Indian classical maestros,
Awesome.
playing all the ragas. And so every week I was listening to new ragas, and we were playing Ravi's music from his band Tassa and exploring that in a kind of more jazz and creative way. But it was really the entrance to the exposure to Indian classical music. And so at the end of that year, my brother and Justin and myself, we traveled to India for the first time, and that's when I've met my guru, or my musical teacher, that became, this was, I didn't know at the time, but we had these incredible lessons that was like the tip of the iceberg of learning Indian classical music with a master musician in India. We had about, I think, 8 or 9 lessons. They were each about 3 or 4 hours long,
Cool.
and just like incredible, an incredible exposure to Indian classical music in the land in Calcutta, in my guru's, his name is Shantanu Bhattacharya, in his apartment in Calcutta, and it was really, it was such a formative experience, that it has such an impact that even after that trip, it was a 5 week trip to India. We came back, and it was, I had to finish my university, but there was some seed planted in that moment that kind of kept, I kept watering, but it kept growing, and it led me to go back to India again, and then I stayed there for many, many, many years. But I would say that, growing up and learning music and learning how to play an instrument was something that, it took my passion, but it opened me up to the bigger questions. And then where that led me was to explore different cultures and different musics, and then not just from a listening perspective, but from a lived perspective. Like, I'm gonna go, and I didn't know I was gonna go live in India for 10 years, but that's what ended up happening, just because of the calling and the connection and the relationship to my guru and his family. I really was adopted into his family and was able to learn in such a traditional way. So yeah, I mean, that's a little bit about how I got started and how I ended up in India for so long. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So you really started basically very early to be influenced also by raga music. That's
Yeah.
great. For our listeners, can you explain a little bit what classical Indian music or raga music is?
Sure, yeah. So in the West, I grew up, learning the saxophone, and that was more rooted in what we would call Western classical music, but the saxophone's really a jazz instrument. That's where you see most of its expression, and that's why I also was called to that music. So learning, um, Western music, and jazz, and all the different types of music within Western music, that was the starting place. And then Indian classical music was like a totally different form of music, um, in so many different ways, and yet we find all of these kind of universal similarities in many different musics from around the world. As different as they are, they're also somehow very similar, in their purpose, or in their, sometimes even in their expression. So that was a big part of my journey, was trying to like forget, or kind of put in one compartment the information that I had learned from Western music, in order to have an open, clear mind to learn Indian classical music. And then it was a process of like trying to find all those connections. And so for listeners that are not so familiar, um, with Indian classical music, or the raga, I'd say the biggest difference between most Western musics, again, there's so many different genres and different styles that it's hard to like generalize in one way, but um, in Indian classical music, there's a real focus on the expression of the artist, as their rendering of a raga. The ragas are kind of these entities that are known, that are worked with, and then they're expressed. And so what that looks
Mm,
like in a musical way is that there's a collection of notes, like a scale that we would have in the West, like a major scale, minor scale, or something like that. They have so many different collections of notes. But then even more specific is that the way that you move through the melody in this collection of notes is what brings the real essence of the raga, and that expresses certain emotions or certain feelings that are connected to nature. Really, they're connected to the time of day. There are ragas for early morning, like throughout all the different periods of the day. And I think that was one of the things that at the very beginning was such a it was just such an incredible exposure and like realization, was to be like, wait, this music is connected to nature so deeply that you only play certain ragas at certain times. That was such a foreign concept, even learning anything in Western music. It was so amazing to be able to to kind of have that realization, but then to get to experience it. One of the first things that my guru would say is like, okay, well, you have to learn to sing because this music is a vocal music. And I was like, well, I'm not a singer. Like, no, I play saxophone. Like, it's like, leave your instrument at home, come, and here's the tampura, which is an Indian instrument. It's a drone instrument, and you play it as four strings, and it creates the drone, which then you sing on top of. And then that's one of the key or core aspects of Indian classical music or raga, is that there's a drone. And the way that I like how it's described is the drone is kind of like the canvas, which
Mm,
then the raga or the musician will then paint the melodies or the raga, the phrases and the essences onto that drone, onto that
mhm,
canvas. And the form of Indian classical music in vocal is called khayal, which a translation of that could be imagination. So it's almost like the imagination that's being that's coming from partly the mind or the heart of the musician, but also the the essence of what that raga is. And ragas are known all across the lands and now around the world, where people will recognize the same raga because you're following the same pathways. You're following the same routing of melodies, and you're evoking the same essence of feelings, obviously in a unique or in an individualistic way when you're performing, but you're connecting to something that's more collective or more universal.
okay. So each rag has basically may specific notes which the musician is then working with, and is it more like more improvisation than in classical European or Western music?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I think at first the understanding was, okay, it's Indian classical music. This must be like Western classical music. And then and yet I'm a jazz musician. I'm learning this. I think one of the reasons that I was called to it, other than the beauty and the inherent spirituality, the feeling that I got from it, was Indian classical music kind of falls right in the middle. If you think about jazz and improvised music, that is very much in the moment. You can create and come up with almost anything, very very free in that way, versus Western classical music, which is completely composed, right? It's written, and it's more about the expression of the composer and then the rendering of that exact thing. That's the Western classical music. Indian classical music is like right in the middle, because every time you perform or you play a raga, you are improvising. You're improvising in that moment a unique version or variation of something that you've spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours cultivating, over and over. So yes, you are working with material which is repeated and is passed on in lineages through gurus and shisha, or like disciples. Um, but it's also in your own working with the raga, where then when you eventually maybe perform it, even if you're just working for your own purposes, it's about being with that thing, and it's about being in the flow of that moment while also adhering to, you could call them rules, but just the pathways, the things that are, there's in that sense, you could say there's very specific rules. And in that setting, when I was in the very first few years of learning ragas, it was very much like right or wrong. No, no, you can't do this. This is the way it has to be, because that's how we have to learn at first, only to
Mhm.
then realize, okay, there's a lot more nuance. And since traveling back from India and living here, I often will blur those lines. Like even at the beginning here, I played a piece and I said, okay, it's inspired by Rag Charukeshi. I kind of played just Charukeshi, but at moments I let myself move into new territory that I would not necessarily play in a traditional classical, Indian classical setting. It wasn't very far out. I wasn't being really, really crazy creative and doing other things with it, but it kind of, it shows you that there is an expectation to adhere to a certain thing. You can't just take whatever you want and change it. That's what makes it a classical tradition. And yet it is also very improvisational. So I think that's what is beautiful about where Indian classical music lies in that kind of spectrum of more fixed and more free. It's
Right.
beautifully in the middle. Yeah.
That's interesting. So you have basically, when you take a rag for the morning, for example, so you have a specific setting, and then basically while you're playing it, the practitioner basically connects with that or becomes one with it in a way. So,
Yeah.
what are the different purposes or origins of this raga? So can you talk about one specifically just to get an idea?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the easiest connection that is, spoken about or shared, even with the audience, like again, to remember that in most settings, Indian classical music is still kind of in this, I would say it maybe an older way of, um, and not older in the sense that it's an older tradition. I mean older in the sense that I'm looking to a future where we have less clear lines between performer and audience in my world, and where I like the idea where we can all be music makers. But in the sense of saying that yes, there are performers and there's an audience. I found it incredible that in India, the level of understanding, the appreciation, but also the knowledge of the meanings, the timings, the intricacies of the raga are known by the audience. That would be, maybe you could find that in Western classical music where you have, real connoisseurs of opera, and they know every detail, the history of the composer and the versions that when it was released and the different singers. But also to the depth of knowing the notes, the harmony, which scales are we in. So that's like you would find that in Indian classical music that the people who really love the music are actually dive deep into the subject, even as a listener, as an appreciator of the music. And I think that's very beautiful. Um, so I think, yeah, like the purposes behind it, I think one is people feel called to it because it creates that feeling of connection. If you're the performer, maybe you feel connected to the music or the divine, and you're rendering a raga in that moment. And the audience also feels that, even though they're not the one like singing that raga, they might be moving along, but they're almost tracing the journey that the performer is on. And that way, I think it's a lot about presence, but also devotion and connection to the universal sense. And that's why it takes practice, right? It's something that, yes, we do have the possibility to have that in a flash and intuition, but if we want to have access to it ongoing, then it's something we need to practice. And so, you asked for an example, like if there was a morning raga, say rag Bhairav, right? That's something that anyone who listened to Indian classical music who either studied as a practitioner or a performer of it, but also the listeners would know that okay, rag Bhairav is a early morning raga, and that's when you will hear that, or that's when you will cultivate. And the essence of that raga actually kind of paints or portrays the feeling at that time of day. So you could imagine the sun rising, and as it's just getting brightening, the sky is brightening with maybe a red or orange sunlight, and there's this rising feeling, and that's the feeling that the raga will evoke. Now, obviously, there's different forms of the music. And that's something that makes it more traditional or more classical. And there's all these different schools, they call them gharanas, and there's different ways of performing within that format. But if you just think about the essence of the raga, what the phrases represent, the different emotions that it can bring up, obviously we know emotions are somewhat subjective. But when we all agree or we all have an understanding that there's something which is activating that emotion, we can all tap into that. And that's what the ragas do a lot, is there'll be an associated feeling or emotion that's attached to the raga, that's attached to the time of day, and then that's kind of what everybody is basking in that journey through the raga, as it's being rendered, let's say. And I found that incredible that the connection of the notes to just the position of the sun in the sky, where the fine tunings. One misconception of, I would say, Indian classical music is that the music is microtonal. It is microtonal in the sense that there's more specific tunings for more notes, but they don't all happen at once. It's more like the position of the note changes according to the time of day, which is just an incredible thing to think about, that there's this music that has been cultivated for so many hundreds of years that is so deeply connected to nature, what's around us. There's also seasonal ragas. So there's ragas that are for the monsoon, that evoke the feeling of thunder and lightning and rain. And this is just the essence of the raga, not even going into the lyrics. The lyrics are important because the lyrics often tell the stories. And there's many lyrics that are somewhat more romantic, but there's also ones that are very much spiritual and connected to divinity, or worship. Um, and that's also a really beautiful thing I found in the tradition in India, was within the musician kind of community, there was such an opening to an acceptance of all beliefs or all religions. You would find musicians of all different faiths singing the names of the gods, or of their god in the songs. And the passing down of these traditions through generations. It's very beautiful, and that so the words also can evoke the feelings that are in the ragas. As an instrumentalist who does not perform singing, or I would not perform singing in Hindi. Um, you know, uh, the I'm working more with the essence, the feeling of the raga that I have learned and steeped in, and then I try to, kind of offer that as a guidance when I'm working with, say an audience, or if I'm working with, in a sound bath or in a sound healing session, then I can work with that more specifically. But yeah, it's a whole world. There are hundreds and hundreds of ragas. So, it's like each one has its own, its own feeling, its own entity. And some of them are very, very close to each other. They have very, very similar but slightly different routing. It's really incredible, the the whole woven family of ragas. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like dialing in with that in a certain frequency in that moment. It's like, when we both think, I think the world is, really vibrational. And if you have this thinking, yeah, then it makes sense because during the day, so the vibration, the energy is different. So when you use a raga in the morning, you can really go into, as it align yourself with that time of the day, also be then in better flow, I would say. And so when you say that, in that sense that you can really then resonate better, okay, in alignment with or in connection with that energy of that day. Um, I'm also thinking of a different form of invoking specific energies, which is a puja. Puja is a ceremony or ritual used in Hinduism in India, but it really has a Vedic origin. And these ceremonies also they use, fire recitation, incense to connect and yeah, connect with higher realms, so to say. Um, and so the origin of these pujas are in the Vedic scriptures, the Yajurveda as well. For raga or raga music, it's in the Samaveda. But how are they somehow different, you would say, or are they a complete different different storage, so to say? Yeah.
I mean, I think so many scholars, or maybe my guru or my musicians could probably speak to the real um, the history or the evolution of that in greater detail than I can, in a sense. But my experience was, I was in many pujas in different places in India, or many kind of rituals or ceremonies, and often I would feel that vibrational quality to the what was happening, that ritual. Many times there was, it was, if it was a death ceremony, or if it was a coming of age ceremony, then like there would be a priest that would be the one that would kind of given the one who would be guiding, but they would always invite, the other people involved in the puja into that recitation of the mantra, or into the offering, into the actual worship, into the puja. um, and so I mean that's a very specific tradition that I was, I think, fortunate and privileged enough to have the exposure to, but it's also not my upbringing, so it wasn't like something that I grew up with, and that I could, it was, there was sometimes hard for me to access because it was very foreign, so I had to really open myself to try and feel into that practice. But what I did find was like I did that with music, and that's where the path of rag music or Shastriya Sangeet is really that act of the worship every time. I would sit in my meditation through music. I would sit in my devotion through music, or I would sit through my worship in music. And I would sit and I would light a candle and an incense, and then I would sit and put on the tampura, the drone, and I would go into being in this kind of communion with the sound. And that's where vibrationally, I think, I probably didn't recognize it at the moment. I didn't recognize that I was doing this type of ritual. It was something that I was, I probably at that point in my life, I was approaching it more mentally. It was okay, this is a subject, I'm learning the subject, but actually I was benefiting and, kind of cultivating that sense of ritual, which now in my life, I really look at how do we evoke spirit in different ways. And music is one of the most powerful tools, to evoke spirit. I mean, you spoke about in certain rituals in different traditions, there's the fire, or there's the offering, or there's the recitation. And again, they all have different powers, different energies, but a lot of it has to do with how do we evoke the spirit that we're asking for, or we're looking to be in connection with. And so that's what I find really beautiful and fascinating about working with sound. Um, again, on a spectrum from working with just vibration to more sound to more music. There's
Mhm.
everything in between, and we can kind of jump into different places on that spectrum and work in that way, or we can kind of try to work with it all. And I found more and more as I dive deeper and deeper into sound healing work, I tend to move around a lot more. There are times where I'm really in that musical space, that I'm tapping into my experience of my music and being able to use that in a sound healing context. Or maybe I'm just tapping into the sound aspect. It's not really a musical thing at all. It's more I'm working with sound, or vibration.
You already spoke about sound healing now. Um, yeah, how did you get in touch with sound healing? Was it really, like you said, you just explained this personal, just did it just evolve for you? Was there an aha moment? Yeah. How did it all
Yeah.
happen for you?
So I think there was already, um, being accepted or kind of, brought into my guru's family. Um, it was like a musical family. We did music every day. It was 6 hours in the morning, 6 hours in the evening or afternoon. We had meals, and it was just that. Unless we were going out to do a performance or to go on an errand, we were basically doing music the whole time. And that was challenging, but it was also so beautiful. And to be a part of his family for so long, um, you know, was such a privilege. But also what came along with that was also the spirituality of the music, but also his family's own spirituality. And my guru grew up in the ashram in Pondicherry, the Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's
Mhm,
ashram,
mhm,
and and so that was also a big piece of was sitting and reading Sri Aurobindo or the Mother, and being in that yoga, the integral yoga, and going to Pondicherry and visiting Oroville, and that became a big part of my time in India. So there was already kind of that essence of spirituality built into my life there. But I think, in my very first trip, I remember going up to Darjeeling from Calcutta, and in the streets of Darjeeling, up in the mountains, the Himalayas, these are the foothills of the Himalayas. There's all these kind of Tibetan or Nepalese stores that have idols, brass idols and stuff, and of course they have singing bowls. And so I think immediately my musical curiosity said, "What's this singing bowl thing?" And I said, "Well, I can if I get my tuner out, I can find all these different notes." So my first instinct was to create an instrument with the singing bowls. And so I went around, and the first trip I think I got probably 3 or 4 singing bowls, and then the next trip I got 5 more, and then by the third trip I had a whole set that I had curated by checking the tuning of each of the notes of the bowls and basically created an instrument that I could play music with. And so I started to integrate that instrument into different music and albums that I released over the years. But I also started to just basically play those as an instrument for people. And what started to happen was people basically started to like be very relaxed and very, kind of meditative. Sometimes they might lay down. And so in a way, I was already offering sound baths before I even
Mhm.
knew what a sound bath was. And
Interesting.
and yeah, I think I spent a lot of time up in McLeodganj Dharamshala, which is in North India in the foothills of the Himalayas. It's where the Dalai Lama has, it's the
Mhm,
Tibetan
mhm,
government in
mhm.
exile, and so I spent a lot of time up there, especially in the hot summer in Calcutta. I would go to the mountains; it was cooler, and I would go hiking and take my little bansuri up in the mountains, um, and I was fortunate enough to be at some of the teachings of the Dalai Lama and to be in that world. But I remember hearing an interview or a quote of the Dalai Lama. Someone asked him about, what do you think about artists, musicians, and artists today? And he said, so many musicians, are expressing their suffering, and that's why people can relate to it. But
Mhm,
it's only an expression of suffering. um, we need more musicians who create music with the intention to heal, not just
mhm,
to express their suffering. And there was something about that in me snapped, that all of my whole journey, my path of learning music, going deep into jazz and very intellectual, so many so many notes, how to be able to control all these different chords, and then Indian classical music again, very very technical, very intellectual in one sense. Very high levels of intricacies in the architecture of the sound or the notes. And and it kind of hit me where it was like, oh, I feel called to create music that can really transform for people, that people can use it to transform something in themselves, whether you call that healing or transformation, or peace or meditation. And that really spoke to me, and I think that was my kind of aha moment of like, this is what I need to be doing. I don't feel called to go um, and just play anywhere as entertainment. There's a use and a purpose, and I respect the many moments in my life where I've played music for entertainment, or the musicians that do that. I think that we all have different gifts, and so some musicians are really incredible at offering that type of entertainment, but something that calls us into a deeper experience. That's what I think I was finding and discovering in myself. And so at that point, I started to just like look deeper into, okay, wait, what is sound healing? And I started to discover some of the real pioneers, in this age. Obviously, sound healing has been used for thousands of years. If we think back to Pythagoras and other traditions, but in this day and age, and one of the people that I was able to kind of reach out to and connect with is John Bouliot, which is where we met, which is so nice,
Great.
that connection. But that was someone that I think I really needed in that moment for me to kind of step more deeply into what sound healing and its possibilities were. And so I was able to kind of start working with the tuning forks and studying with John, and that's what really took me into trying to explore more about, okay, what is this music, or what is this offering of sound, and music, and how to create and hold space in a sound bath, and then okay, eventually how to work with clients one on one. So that was really kind of it was, I would say, a natural trends, moving into that. But but yeah, it was something that I think it was just a calling at that moment in my life. It was like, okay, and it wasn't just all of a sudden all my life moved to that. I still produce and create creative music and art music in that way, but more of my time is dedicated towards sharing how music and sound can be transformational or healing. Yeah.
So imagine a musician would be interested to do sound healing. So what would you tell that person or any person really what the difference is?
Yeah, well, this is the beautiful thing I found recently in teaching sound healing and working. I've been working with the Sound Healing Academy and teaching the courses for them, but doing in-person workshops. And I find that the people that are attracted or being called to do work with sound, we can call it sound healing or sound work. Um, such a wide spectrum, and on some, on one side we have people that have zero musical knowledge or identify very little with music, or in fact, they might even have like a resistance to the idea of music, but they feel really called into sound or into vibration. And on the other end, you have musicians who have spent maybe most of their life working with music, and they're very skeptical around this idea of, wait, you can do this in some healing capacity. And so working with people in person has been really beautiful because it's been kind of like a bridging of those two ends of the spectrum, or that world, a coming, a circle moment in a way, because I think we anybody can be musical. We all are musical innately. So even people that have this kind of imprint that they're not musical, or they don't have a good ear, or the information is too complex for them, that's those are all things that you can break through. You can start to work with sound with zero musical experience. And on the other end, if you have lots of music experience, then you have so much you can already draw upon, but you might need to work with understanding the self, psychology of the self, understanding what it's like to know how music affects you internally more and more, bringing it more into the heart or the gut than in the head. And musicians know this, but I think a lot of times it's unconscious, or it's something that they do more for themselves than knowing that it's so powerful, or can be so powerful for other people as well.
So it's probably kind of what the difference of music and or sound healing is, or when sound or music becomes sound healing is maybe the setting. Then you mentioned the intention of the practitioners, kind of what purpose is set into it. Um, I've also heard you talking about different forms of listening. What is there anything, on the basically receiver side which makes it maybe more a sound healing or transformative experience?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that's exactly it. I think it has a lot to do with the set, like the setting or the framework that you work within, and it has to do with the intention that's behind it. We know from many great practitioners or people who worked at the when we set intentions, there's an amplification that happens, right? When we add sound to other modalities, there's an amplification that can happen of that modality. Vibration and sound can help um, you know bring even more than what might be there without that. And so yes, from the practitioner side, it has a lot to do with how you create that space and how you hold that space and the intention that you put behind your own offering. But then how do you encourage that in the client or the listener? And that's something where I think that has the beautiful thing about it is that it's a really about community. In a say a group setting, you're creating communities or spaces where people are coming together to basically deepen their listening, right? We all have, anyone that can hear that's not deaf, um, you know has the and even people that are deaf have different ways of listening, right? Or of hearing or feeling things. But if you can hear the vibrations coming through your ears, then we're constantly bombarded with sound. And when we pay attention to those sounds, we go from hearing to listening, right? That's where our attention is now brought to what we're listening to. And I think the next level is that deepening into deep listening, where it becomes meditative, it becomes something that can be transformative or can be more powerful in that way, just because we're allowing or we're practicing how to go deeper into that listening. And then when we start to add on things like visualization or intention, then we can start to, with a knowledge of what's going on internal, your parts inside of you, or, archetypes or elements, things like this, then we can start to work on a deeper level of transformation.
So, um, when you think of, sound healing and sound baths, are there a particular person you would suggest sound healing for? Would you say for some people or for whom would sound healing be particularly interesting, or for others maybe not? What do you think?
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we see sound healing becoming so, so popular, is that it really is very accessible to so many, different people from different backgrounds, from different kind of yeah, just different interests. You can have people in a sound bath who have completely different tastes in music, you know, but because they're coming there for a different reason, they're very open to whatever sounds might be there. Obviously, there's some kind of there are some instruments that have become more common in sound healing, things like the singing bowls or the crystal bowls or the gongs or drums, and that's because they have an effect and a specific, they kind of, again, they evoke a certain thing, a certain feeling, so they become very common. But what I found is that when I integrate the instruments that I feel most closely connected to, like the flute or the clarinet or saxophone, even that I can integrate that into a sound bath and take someone into a new place or into a new journey. And so I think that's what's, every facilitator or every practitioner is going to bring their own unique take on it, and that will specifically call to different people, and that's where you can see that there's not one person or one way of doing it. It's actually about the creativity and the confidence that each person has around how they want to offer that to other people, and then people that are open to that will show up and enjoy that. So I think that's the people that I think will be called to sound baths are people that are looking for something that, like, a different experience, right? Oftentimes I think in life we look for or maybe we just have experiences happen to us and then we're kind of dealing with, okay, this thing happened to me, and you're trying to deal with it. And at a certain point we start to look for experiences, and we say, oh, that's why we travel, or we go experience other things, or we join some activity that we haven't done before. um, but I think, yeah, when you already, most people have a connection to music. There's something about from birth all the way till death, where we have this deep relationship with sound and music. So everyone has that, and being, called to like a sound bath or an experience like that, it could be someone in the late stages of their life. It could be someone in midlife, who is struggling and is having a hard time with anxiety or sleeping, and they just want a place where they're able to like relax. That is the number one thing that sound healing offers, is like a relaxation, right? We're so bombarded by things, by vibrations, by energy, um, and we're tense, and so we have to actually practice relaxing ourselves so that we don't, kind of internalize a lot of this tension. And that's what a lot of times sound baths are offering the most for people, is just that chance, that opportunity to offer themselves a chance to relax and to process really what, everything we go through every day. And it's beautiful because you can do that in community, right? In a group. So
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for being my guest today. Um, do you want to just share a little bit about your actually work, what you're doing right now, and where people can find you who want to learn or experience music with you and sound healing?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm based here in Toronto, and so I'm offering sound baths in the city, but I also offer one-on-one sessions with clients. So if you happen to be in Toronto or you're coming, please, you can reach out to me. And if you are elsewhere in the world, then some of the other things that I'm offering, like I do kind of mentor or teach. If you are interested in learning more, and that can be done like virtually online, if you want to connect in that way. I There is a wonderful series coming up that Svaram, which is a sound healing workshop in Oroville, is releasing, and I'll be doing one of their workshops coming up. Maybe you can post the details, or I'll put it in
Yes,
a comment
we will.
below. So it's coming up this summer, and yeah, you can find my music online, like on streaming sites, but also Bandcamp, which is typically better for artists. And yeah, I'm working on new music, and I'm also working on creating more tools for people. So working with, kind of intentionally created journeys of sound or tracks that use instruments like the tuning forks, um, and how to offering that to people and then doing it in community. So I have my site called Nod Yoga. Has it's I'm just starting to build an online community for that, and starting to release um, tracks that can help people that can use it for different purposes, whether it's a visualization or a guidance towards things using different sound healing instruments. Yeah. And so that you can go to my website, andrew-k.ca or nodyoga.com, and you can find me online that way.
Okay, perfect. And we will post everything online as well, so people can just click the link. Well, it was great to have you. Do you want to share anything else? Your insight of the day or something? With the
Yeah, thanks. I mean, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to connect even in this way. The beauty of this day and age is how we can connect from so far away, and also how we can share, these conversations and these ideas all around the world, and that makes us more closely connected than ever. And we can also be more disconnected than ever, being kind of drawn into, I think, the digital world. And I think that's the time that we're in, is how do we choose uh, uh, what how do we want to be present, and I feel it often when I have my device and I'm being pulled into something that feels passive or feels like it's almost draining, yet there's a magnetism to it. And often I have to work to take a breath and ground myself and come back into the physical reality and connect with someone in my physical world. That's something that I think sound can really help with, and that a reconnection to ourselves and each other. Because even though it's beautiful to connect this way from far away, oftentimes if we are not connected to the land that's around us or ourselves internally, then we end up being quite lost. So I would say find your own way to use your own sound, your own way of making sound, or your own instruments, or your own connection to music as a way to bring yourself back into the present moment, and to really show up fully in your body and in your space in the world.
Great. That's awesome. That's one thing I also heard from my mentor all the time is, stay grounded, not just be somewhere out there. We really have to stay grounded in the present. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrew. It was really great to have you. And yeah, hopefully we meet each other again somewhere along the way.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I
Okay.
really appreciate it.
Bye bye.